Sheriff Cobb stood on the porch step of the cabin with the paper in his hand, and he read it the way a man reads a verdict, flat and final, so that no one in the yard could pretend they had misheard him. "By the law of this state," he said, "a white man cannot be married to a Mongolian woman, and so this marriage was never a marriage at all." The camp went quiet enough to hear the creak. Mei Ling did not let go of Tom Doyle's hand, and Tom Doyle did not let go of hers. "Say it again," he told the sheriff, "so the whole camp hears it twice." The sheriff was not finished. "If the marriage never existed," he said, "then the deed to the claim and the cabin standing behind them had never rightly passed to a wife, only to a stranger a man had let live in his house." Mei Ling felt the yard's eyes move to her hands, to the flour still dusting her sleeve from the bread she had left rising on the table inside, in the kitchen she had built herself, board by board, out of a house that was, by paper, no longer hers to claim at all. Tom did not raise his voice, and he did not reach for the shotgun leaning inside the door, though later men would say they watched him measure the distance to it. He only asked the sheriff one question, quiet enough that the whole yard leaned in to catch it. Whose law was old enough to say a woman who had built a home was nobody at all? To understand what the camp would do next, you had to go back 7 months, to a train platform, and a manifest that had never once written down her name. Because on the day she arrived, Mei Ling had not been a wife or even a person on any document that mattered. She had been an entry in a ledger, a debt to be collected, a crate to be signed for at the bottom of a hill town built on gold and rail iron. What happened between that first cold morning and this one, on the porch, with a sheriff's paper trying to erase a marriage the whole camp had watched happen with their own eyes, was the story of how a name gets given back to a woman, one act of defiance at a time. The train did not stop long enough at Granite Creek for anyone to call it a station, only a plank platform nailed together at the base of a hill scarred yellow-white by hydraulic hoses, and Mei Ling stepped down into a wind that smelled of wood smoke, mule sweat, and turned earth. A man in a canvas coat checked a list against the handful of Chinese passengers stepping off, calling names that were not quite names, numbers scratched beside each one in a ledger bound in oilcloth. Hers was the last entry on the page. Chen, contracted, Granite Creek, paid in full. No one asked if the ink was correct. She had crossed an ocean and a continent folded into that single line, and now she stood with her cloth bundle against her chest, the carved jade hairpin from her mother's hair still wrapped inside a strip of silk, watching wagons loaded with lumber and blasting powder pass on their way up toward diggings that glittered faintly, even from this distance, like something worth a person's whole life. Somewhere up that grade was the man who had paid the debt attached to her name. She did not yet know if he had asked for a wife or only for a hand that could cook and count. Broker Yuan walked her up the grade himself, reciting the terms of the contract the way another man might recite scripture, as though saying them often enough made them righteous. Her father's debt in Canton, incurred the year of the flood, had passed to her upon his death, and Yuan had sold the paper to a foreman named Thomas Doyle, who needed a housekeeper and had not been particular about how the arrangement was worded. Marriage, Yuan said, was simply the cleanest way to settle it without trouble from the company or the sheriff, a paper convenience, nothing a woman like her should mistake for a courtship. Mei Ling listened and said nothing, because saying nothing was the only power the manifest had left her. Ahead, the camp opened into a muddy street lined with a general store, an assay office, and canvas tents patched with tin, and men stopped their work to watch her pass the way they might watch a wagon of new equipment arrive, appraising, already arguing in low voices about whether the foreman had been cheated on the price. She kept her chin level and her eyes on the ridge above the camp, where the granite went gold in the late sun, and told herself that a debt was not the same thing as a name. At the general store, Otis Pratt weighed a sack of flour for a miner still owing him from spring, and wrote the balance in chalk without a second thought. But when Mei Ling set 2 coins on the counter for a smaller sack, he asked to see the coins twice, turned them over as if they might be counterfeit, and told her plainly that he did not extend credit to her kind, contract or no contract. It was not shouted. It was almost polite, the way a man refuses a dog at his table without raising his voice, and that politeness was somehow worse than anger would have been. Behind her, Broker Yuan said nothing in her defense, already counting the coins Doyle owed him for the month's board. Mei Ling took her flour, the exact weight and not a grain more, and walked back out into the street where a woman from the church wives' circle looked her up and down and asked Yuan, in a voice pitched to Carrie, whether the girl understood English at all. Mei Ling answered in careful, correctly ordered English that she understood a great deal, and watched the woman's face rearrange itself around the surprise, filing the moment away the way she filed everything now, as a fact she might need later. That night, in the small back room Yuan had arranged for her until the foreman returned from the rail grade, she heard two men talking through the thin plank wall about whether Doyle would even keep her, given that he'd been away 3 weeks, and hadn't so much as sent word he understood what the broker had arranged in his name. One of them said if Doyle backed out, Yuan would simply sell the contract again, maybe to the assayer, who'd been asking, or to the company store, which could always use a cook who didn't complain. Mei Ling lay on the thin cot with her bundle under her hand and unwrapped the silk far enough to touch the cool curve of the jade hairpin, the one thing that had crossed the ocean that was entirely hers, bought by no one, owed to no one. She thought of her mother's voice telling her that jade did not shatter, it only wore smooth, and she decided, in the dark, in a camp that had not yet learned her name, that she would wear smooth too, whatever the men on the other side of the wall decided about her without asking. Whatever this Thomas Doyle turned out to be, she would meet him as herself, not as the entry in Yuan's ledger. Thomas Doyle came down off the rail grade 3 days later with rock dust still in the creases of his hands, and no notion that a debt he'd bought to settle a foreman's dispute with Yuan had been quietly turned, on paper, into a marriage contract while he was gone. The men in the yard found it a fine joke and told him so before he'd even set down his pack, calling out that his housekeeper had arrived and wasn't she a fine-looking arrangement, wasn't he the lucky one, and worse besides, loud enough that Mei Ling, stepping out onto the cabin porch at the sound of his name, heard every word of it plainly. Doyle's face did not do what the men expected. He did not laugh along, and he did not look at her the way they wanted him to look, appraising, amused. He looked, instead, faintly furious, though it took her a moment to understand the fury wasn't aimed at her. He set his pack down hard enough that the yard went quiet and said, in a voice that carried without being raised, that Yuan had a great deal of explaining to do and that nobody in this camp had bought a wife today, whatever the paper said, because he hadn't asked for one. When the yard finally emptied, Doyle climbed the porch steps slowly, the way a man approaches something he has already decided he does not want to frighten, and stopped an arm's length from her, turning his hat in his hands instead of looking straight at her, which she found, unexpectedly, easier to bear. He said he was sorry for what she'd had to hear, and sorrier still that Yuan had signed her name to something without asking either of them, and then he asked the one question no one at Granite Creek had bothered to ask since the platform. What was her name? Her real name, not the one written in the ledger. She told him, Chen Mei Ling. He said it back to her carefully, getting the tones wrong the way every Englishman got them wrong, and did not laugh at his own mistake, only asked if he'd said it close enough, and tried again when she told him, gently, that he hadn't quite. It was such a small thing, a man repeating a name until he had it right, but Mei Ling would remember it, later, as the first moment since the flood that had taken her father, that anyone had troubled themselves over getting a single thing about her correct. He showed her the cabin as though it might not meet with her approval, pointing out the stove he'd built himself from scavenged iron, the shelf too high for practical use that he said he'd meant to lower and never had, the single window facing east so the room caught the first light. He told her, without her asking, that he'd come over from County Clare as a boy of 12 with a family that lost their land to a landlord's debt before they'd even boarded the ship, and that he understood something of what it meant to be counted as a number in another man's ledger before anyone troubled to learn your name. It was not a large confession, and he did not dwell on it, but it changed the shape of the room for her, made the cabin feel less like a cell she'd been delivered into, and more like a place built by someone who had once needed shelter just as badly. She told him, in return, that her father had been a merchant and her mother an herbalist, and that she could read a ledger as well as cook from one, and Doyle looked at her for a long moment and said that Yuan had undersold her by every measure he could think of. Yuan came by the cabin the next morning to collect his final payment and to remind Doyle, pleasantly, that whatever understanding the two of them reached between themselves, the paper he'd filed at the assay office described a marriage, not an employment, and that a man who let it stand as a marriage without making it a real one before the county clerk was leaving a door open that anyone with a grievance could walk through later. Doyle asked what grievance he meant. Yuan only smiled the smile of a man who traded in other people's contracts for a living and said that Granite Creek had a sheriff who enforced the state's marriage statutes strictly whenever it suited someone with influence to have them enforced, and that a Chinese wife standing in this county had always been a fragile kind of arithmetic, easy to write down, easy to erase. He left without waiting for an answer. Mei Ling, listening from the doorway, understood before Doyle said a word that whatever peace they might build inside these four walls, it would always be measured against a law that had not been written with her in it at all, and that understanding settled into her chest like a stone she would carry, unspoken, for months. She reorganized the cabin's shelves within a week, not asking permission, only doing it the way her mother had once reordered a household after a bad season, by instinct and by need, and cooked a meal from what she found in the stores. Dried mushrooms she'd carried from home rehydrated into a broth, rice stretched with wild onion she'd gathered along the creek, a plate set down in front of Doyle with more care than he was used to receiving from anyone, including himself. He ate slowly, the way a man eats when he is trying not to show how much a small kindness has undone him, and admitted, finally, that he could not remember the last meal that had tasted like someone meant it for him specifically, rather than for a table of hungry men in general. She told him in her careful English that in her mother's kitchen food was medicine as much as food, that flavor was only the visible half of the reason a dish was made a certain way, and he asked, half joking, whether that meant the broth would cure his aching shoulder, and she said, without joking at all, that it might help, and it did. A week later, she found Doyle hunched over his claims account book at the table, cursing quietly at a column of figures that would not balance no matter how many times he added it. The tally of ore weighed against the assay office's reported value never quite matching what the numbers on his own scale told him. She asked carefully if she might look, and he pushed the book toward her more out of exhaustion than confidence. It took her the better part of an hour, tracing each entry against the dates in the margin, before she found it. A small, consistent shortfall on every third weighing, always rounded down, never up, a pattern too regular to be an honest man's error. She showed him the pattern in silence, letting the numbers argue for themselves, and watched his face change as he understood what she was telling him, that Whitlock the assayer had been skimming a fraction off every claim in camp, small enough that no one man would ever notice alone, but large enough, added across a season and a county, to matter a great deal to somebody. Doyle sat back and looked at her, the way a man looks at a tool he has just discovered is worth 10 times what he paid for it. Word of the ledger traveled the way everything traveled at Granite Creek, faster on foot than any newspaper could have carried it, and by the end of the week, half the claims on the creek had asked Doyle, half embarrassed, whether his wife might look over their own tallies too. Some men still would not look at her directly when they asked, addressing the request to Doyle as though she were a tool he owned rather than a woman standing beside him. But others, the ones who'd been quietly shorted for years and never had the numbers to prove it, began nodding to her in the street, a small thing that cost them nothing and meant, to her, a great deal. Otis Pratt heard about it too, and did not care for it, since a portion of what the assayer skimmed found its way back to Pratt's own ledger in the form of goods sold at inflated credit to men who couldn't check their own figures. He began, that week, asking Sheriff Cobb pointed questions about whether a foreign woman doing a white man's bookkeeping was strictly proper, questions dressed up as concern for order, and Cobb, who liked Pratt's credit line at the store better than he liked trouble, wrote the questions down. It was Birdie, the cook's orphan girl who ran errands for half the camp in exchange for scraps and attention, who first mentioned that 3 men on the railgrade crew hadn't come down for supper in 2 days, and that when someone had gone up to check, they'd found them burning with fever in their bunks, too weak to sit up. By the next morning it was 5 men, and by the evening after that it was past a dozen, camp fever moving through the crowded bunkhouses the way it always did once it started, fast and without mercy for men already worn down by 12-hour shifts and bad water. The company's contract doctor was 3 days' ride away in Sacramento, and in no hurry, given that sick Chinese laborers on the grade crew were, in the company's arithmetic, a replaceable expense rather than an emergency. Doyle came back from the bunkhouses that night, gray in the face, having watched a man he'd worked beside for 2 years stop making sense between 1 hour and the next, and Mei Ling, watching him, understood that whatever this fever was, it had already outrun whatever the camp knew how to do about it, and that the next days would ask something of her she had never been asked to give before. By the 3rd day of the fever, 2 men had died in the bunkhouse, and a 3rd was not expected to see morning, and the company doctor had sent word by Ryder that he would not be able to reach Granite Creek for at least another week, along with a suggestion that the crew simply be quarantined and left to run its course. Doyle stood in the yard reading that message twice, then walked it straight to the cabin and set it on the table in front of Mei Ling without a word, because by then there was no pretense left between them about what he was asking her to consider. She had told him once, in passing, that her mother had treated fever outbreaks in their own village with roots and barks carried specifically for that purpose, packed in a trunk she had inherited and brought across an ocean. Now the habit looked less like sentiment and more like the only medicine within 3 days' ride that had any chance of working, and the decision in front of her was not whether she was capable, but whether the camp that had priced her like freight would trust a Chinese woman's roots over its own doctor's absence. She opened the trunk that night and found, beneath a false bottom her mother had built for exactly this kind of crossing, packets of dried willow bark, ginger root, chrysanthemum flower, and a dozen other remedies wrapped in paper marked with characters only she could read anymore. A whole pharmacy folded flat and carried 12,000 miles on the chance it might someday matter again. She worked through the bunkhouse for 2 days almost without sleeping, brewing willow bark tea to break the fevers and ginger broth to settle stomachs that could keep nothing else down, wringing cool cloths for foreheads, sitting with men who did not trust her at first and grew too sick to argue. Doyle carried water and firewood and did whatever she told him without asking why, which she noticed, and which mattered more to her than she let herself say aloud. On the morning of the 4th day, the man who had not been expected to see the previous morning sat up, asked weakly for water in his own voice, and lived. By the end of the week, every man who had fallen ill in that bunkhouse was alive, a fact the company doctor's letter, arriving late and unnecessary, could not undo or take credit for. The man she had nursed back from the edge of it, a quiet railroad hand named Hop Singh who had lost a brother on a different stretch of grade the year before, found her by the creek a few mornings later and thanked her the way men in that camp rarely thanked anyone, plainly and without decoration, saying only that he owed her a debt he intended to remember, and that if she ever needed a witness to anything at Granite Creek, in any court or before any man, she should ask for him first. It was a small promise, offered quietly, but it was the first time since the platform that someone had offered her something rather than priced her for something, and she carried the difference with her for the rest of the day. Even the men who had grumbled loudest about Yuen's arrangement now nodded to her in passing, and one of the church wives, who had asked Yuen weeks earlier whether the girl understood English, brought a jar of preserves to the cabin door and left it without a word, which Mei Ling understood, correctly, as an apology too proud to be spoken aloud. Not everyone had turned, but enough had turned that the camp no longer felt, entirely, like enemy ground. Otis Pratt did not send preserves. He watched the camp's mood shift toward the foreman's Chinese housekeeper with a tightening in his jaw that had less to do with sentiment than with arithmetic of his own, since a camp that trusted her ledger eye and her medicine trusted her judgment generally, and a camp that trusted her judgment was a camp less inclined to overlook the small, steady skimming that kept Pratt's store more profitable than its prices alone could explain. He wrote a letter that week to an acquaintance in the county seat, phrased as a concerned citizen's inquiry, asking whether the marriage statutes on the books were being properly observed at outlying camps, and whether a sheriff's office might be persuaded to take a more active interest in verifying such arrangements before they hardened into something harder to undo. He did not mention Doyle by name. He did not need to. Sheriff Cobb, reading the letter a week later over a free meal at Pratt's expense, understood exactly which cabin on Granite Creek the inquiry meant, and folded the letter into his coat pocket the way a man folds away a card he intends to play later, when the timing suits him better than it would tonight. On a cold evening not long after the fever broke, Mei Ling took the jade hairpin from her hair by the stove and let Doyle hold it, something she had not done for anyone since her mother pressed it into her palm on the dock at Canton, and told her that jade did not shatter under pressure the way glass did, it only wore smoother, and that a woman who could bend without breaking would always find her way home eventually, wherever home turned out to be. She told him her mother had died the winter after she sailed, of a fever much like the one that had just moved through the bunkhouse, and that the hairpin was the only object left in the world that had touched her mother's hands and hers both. Doyle turned it carefully in the lamplight, careful as a man handling something he understood to be worth more than anything he owned, and said, after a long quiet, that he understood now why she had never once let Yuen or Pratt see it, why it had stayed wrapped in silk inside a bundle rather than worn where a debt collector's eye might land on it, and decide it belonged to somebody's ledger too. He told her, that same night, the part of his own story he had only sketched before, that there had been a woman once, back when he still worked the Eastern rail lines, a schoolteacher's daughter named Anne he had planned to marry before a bridge collapse took 11 men including her brother, and how the town had quietly decided afterward that a rail foreman who couldn't keep his own crew alive was no fit match for anybody's daughter, whatever Anne herself had wanted. He had come west after that less to find gold than to put enough country between himself and that verdict that he could stop hearing it repeated in every polite silence at church suppers. Mei Ling listened without interrupting, understanding better than most people could have that a verdict handed down by a town's collective opinion could outlast any court's ruling and cut just as deep. And when he finished, she said, simply, that she was sorry, and that she understood now why he had not laughed along with the men in the yard the day he came home to find a wife he hadn't asked for waiting on his porch. Two people made unwanted by other people's judgments, she thought, made a strange, sturdy sort of sense together. Bertie found her own way into the cabin not long after, a girl of perhaps 8, whose mother had died on the wagon road west, and whose father nobody had ever quite located, taken in loosely by the camp cook, and fed by whoever had something extra that day. She turned up at Mei Ling's door one afternoon holding a torn stocking and asked, without any of the careful hesitation the adults in camp still carried, whether the lady who fixed men's fevers could fix a stocking too, since her own mending never held. Mei Ling sat her on the porch step and taught her the stitch while she worked, and Bertie, watching her hands, asked what the marks on the little paper packets from the herb trunk meant, and whether Mei Ling could teach her those too, the way she was teaching her the stitch. It was such an ordinary question, asked with a child's total absence of the caution the grown men and women of Granite Creek still measured out around her, that Mei Ling had to look away for a moment before she could answer, and when she did answer, her voice was not quite steady, because it was the first time anyone in this camp had asked to learn something from her rather than merely accept what she offered. Her English had changed since the platform, and she noticed it herself sometimes mid-sentence, the way a longer, more confident shape now came out of her before she had to search for it word by word the way she once had. She could argue a ledger entry with the assayer's clerk now without rehearsing the sentence first in her head, could tease Doyle gently about the shelf he still hadn't lowered, could tell Bertie a whole story about a fox and a magistrate without losing the thread halfway through. Doyle noticed it too, and told her one evening, half laughing, that she used to answer him in short, careful sentences, like a woman crossing a creek on stones set too far apart, and now she crossed it like she'd built the bridge herself. She said that was because, for the first time since Canton, someone in the room was actually listening for what she meant, rather than waiting for her to finish so he could speak, and that made a person braver with her words than any lesson book ever could. He reached across the table then and took her hand, not as a transaction and not as an apology, simply because he wanted to, and she let him, and neither of them said anything else that evening that needed saying. It was Doyle who raised the subject of making the marriage real rather than a paper Yuen had filed for his own convenience, sitting across from her one night with the account book closed between them for once, saying that he wanted to ask her properly, rather than have it stand as something a broker had arranged behind both their backs. She said yes before he had entirely finished the question, which surprised them both into laughing. The first easy laugh either had allowed themselves in front of the other. But when he rode to the county seat the following week to inquire about a proper license, the clerk behind the counter looked at the details Doyle gave him, the bride's name and origin, and said that he wasn't certain the office could issue a license for that particular pairing, and that Doyle might do better to have a minister simply say the words in front of witnesses and let the community regard it as settled. Since the paperwork was uncertain ground, he'd rather not be the one to test. Doyle rode home with no license and an uneasy feeling he did not mention to her that night, not wanting to spoil what had, until that ride, been the best week of either of their lives. They married on a clear Sunday in early autumn, with a traveling Methodist preacher passing through the district agreeing, after some hesitation and a quiet word from Hop Sing about the fever and who exactly had ended it, to say the words over them in the yard rather than inside his usual church, since no church in the county seat had offered its doors. Half the camp turned out anyway, men from the rail grade standing beside men from the claims, Bertie in a dress the church wives had mended for the occasion, Otis Pratt conspicuously absent. Mei Ling wore the jade hairpin openly for the first time since the platform, and when the preacher asked if there was any objection, the yard stayed silent except for the creek, and Doyle said his vows in a voice steady enough for everyone to hear, and Mei Ling answered in English that did not falter once, sentences she had built herself, no longer crossing on careful stones. There was no license folded into a county book anywhere to mark the day. There was only a yard full of witnesses who had watched her nurse their fevers, mend their ledgers, and teach a motherless girl to sew, and who considered that proof enough. The months that followed settled into a rhythm neither of them had known before, Doyle working the claim through the short mountain summer, while Mei Ling turned the ground behind the cabin into a garden that made the church wives stop and stare over the fence, rows of vegetables from home planted alongside ones she'd learned from the camp cook, bok choy beside beans, ginger root tucked into a sheltered corner where the frost came late. She kept the claims books properly now, no longer just correcting another man's errors but building the ledger herself, and Doyle had taken, without either of them discussing it directly, to introducing her at the assay office and the rail company's paymaster window simply as his wife, daring, with the word, anyone behind either counter to say otherwise. Birdie all but lived at the cabin by midsummer, officially still the cook's ward but functionally theirs in every way that mattered, learning her letters from Mei Ling in the evenings alongside her stitching, and calling the cabin home in a way she had not called anywhere home since the wagon road took her mother. It was, Mei Ling thought sometimes, tending the ginger in the last light of a long day, more life than the manifest at the platform had ever promised her. Not every door in Granite Creek had opened. The church wives' circle still left her off their supper invitations, and the school teacher, new that year from the valley, quietly discouraged Birdie from mentioning too loudly whose kitchen table she did her letters at, worried, she said, about what certain parents might say. But the camp's working center, the men on the grade and the claims who measured a person by what they'd carried through a fever or balanced honestly in a ledger, had folded Mei Ling into its rhythms in 100 small, unspectacular ways. A nod on the street that no longer required thought, an invitation to the harvest supper that came addressed, this year, to both their names, Hop Sing bringing his own mother's recipe to compare against hers, and declaring that hers was better, and he'd deny saying so if asked. Doyle watched all of it with a quiet satisfaction he mostly kept to himself, though once, watching her laugh with Birdie across the table, he told her under his breath that he had not believed, 3 seasons ago, that this particular table would ever hold this particular gathering, and she said that neither had she, and that she had stopped being surprised by what a camp could learn if you gave it a reason to. The trouble arrived, as trouble in Granite Creek generally did, folded inside an otherwise ordinary piece of news. The state legislature in Sacramento had passed a stricter marriage statute that spring, one that named explicitly what an older law had only implied, forbidding marriage between a white citizen and a person of Mongolian descent in terms no clerk could read around anymore. Pratt read about it in a newspaper 3 weeks old and carried the item straight to Sheriff Cobb, along with the letter he'd written the previous autumn, still folded in Cobb's coat pocket where he'd tucked it away to play at a better time. That time, Pratt suggested, had arrived. Since a foreman's household built on a marriage the law now refused even to pretend was ambiguous, made for a clean case a sheriff could enforce, without much fear of the camp turning against him. Cobb said he'd think on it. He did not think on it especially long. Within the week, without any warning sent up the grade, the sheriff began making quiet inquiries around Granite Creek about exactly when the Doyle marriage had taken place, and precisely what paper, if any, existed to prove it. Sheriff Cobb was thorough in the way a man arranges his facts before making trouble official, and over the space of a week he spoke to the traveling preacher, who confirmed he'd said words over the couple but had never filed anything with the county since no license had been presented to him, to the county clerk, who confirmed he'd advised against a formal license the previous autumn because of an ambiguity the new statute had since resolved, and to Otis Pratt, who needed no persuading and supplied a detailed account of how long the arrangement had stood and how thoroughly the camp regarded it as settled. Hop Sing, questioned last, told the sheriff plainly that the whole camp had witnessed the vows and considered the matter closed regardless of what any office in the county seat thought about it, which Cobb wrote down without comment, since a camp's opinion, however unified, carried no legal weight against a statute passed in Sacramento. By the time he rode up toward the Doyle cabin, papers folded in his coat, Cobb had built as tidy a case as he was ever likely to build, telling himself he was only enforcing a law, not making one, as though the distinction absolved him of anything. He found them in the yard, Doyle mending a section of fence and Mei Ling hanging wash on a line strung between two pines, Bertie chasing a hen somewhere near the garden, an entirely ordinary afternoon that Cobb's arrival changed the temperature of before he'd said a single word. He told Doyle, in the careful language of a rehearsed script, that he had reason to believe the marriage claimed at this address had never been properly licensed, that recent changes to state law made the matter considerably more serious than it might once have been, and that he intended to return within the week with the county's formal finding on the question. Doyle asked him flatly what finding there was to make about a marriage the whole camp had watched happen with its own eyes. Cobb said that the camp's eyes did not carry the weight of a county clerk's signature and that he was sorry for it, in the vague way a man is sorry for weather, though everyone in that yard understood he had considerably more power over this than weather. He tipped his hat to Mei Ling on his way out, a courtesy so hollow it felt like its own kind of insult, and rode back down toward the camp. They did not speak much that night, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much, and some of it neither of them had words ready for yet. Mei Ling sat on the porch step after Bertie had been walked back to the cook's tent, turning the jade hairpin over in her hands without taking it out of her hair, thinking of her mother's voice telling her that jade wore smooth under pressure rather than shattering, and wondering whether a marriage could be asked to do the same thing a stone did. Doyle sat beside her without touching her at first, staring out at the dark line of the ridge, and finally said that whatever the county decided, whatever paper Cobb rode back up here with, it would not change one fact he intended to hold on to with both hands, that he had chosen her, in front of witnesses, with his whole intention, and that no clerk's absent signature could unmake a choice a man had actually made. She leaned her head against his shoulder then, and for a while the only sound in the yard was the creek, and, somewhere off past the garden, Bertie's laughter carrying faintly from the cook's tent, a small, ordinary sound that felt, that night, worth defending. Cobb returned exactly a week later, as promised, with the county's formal finding folded into the same coat pocket that had carried Pratt's letter all winter, and he read it from the porch step the way a man reads a verdict, flat and final, so that no one gathered in the yard, and there were a good many gathered by then, word having traveled ahead of him, could pretend they had misheard it. By the law of this state, he said, a white man could not be married to a Mongolian woman, and the union claimed at this address, never having been licensed, had never legally existed at all, which meant, as a consequence, that the deed to the claim and cabin, filed solely in Thomas Doyle's name, had never rightly extended any interest whatsoever to the woman living in it, whatever she had built into it. The yard went silent enough to hear the creak. Mei Ling did not let go of Doyle's hand, and Doyle did not let go of hers. "Say it again," he told the sheriff, quiet and even, so the whole camp hears it twice. And Cobb, uncomfortable now under the weight of every eye in that yard, read the finding again, word for word, into a silence that had nothing forgiving left in it at all. The finding did more than sting pride. Within days, a notice arrived from the rail company's land office reminding Doyle that claims and leaseholds registered to unmarried men were subject to review under company policy, meant to discourage what the notice delicately called irregular households, a policy no one had ever bothered to enforce against him while the county still regarded him as married. Pratt, citing the same finding, informed Mei Ling directly, with the same hollow politeness Cobb had used, that he could no longer in good conscience extend even the limited goodwill he'd shown her these past months, since extending credit to an unmarried woman, keeping house with a man not her husband was, in his words, not an arrangement a respectable establishment could be seen to encourage. The schoolteacher quietly informed the cook that Bertie's continued lessons at the cabin might need to be reconsidered given the circumstances, a suggestion that landed harder than anything Pratt had said, since it threatened the one relationship in camp that had cost Mei Ling nothing to build and asked nothing of her but her own patient teaching. Doyle read each notice as it arrived and said less and less each time, a silence Mei Ling recognized, by the third day, as something closer to a decision forming than to despair. On the fourth night, unable to sleep, Mei Ling packed her cloth bundle by lantern light, quietly enough not to wake him, telling herself it was only sensible, that a man's claim and a child's schooling and a whole camp's fragile peace were worth more than her staying to be the reason all of it unraveled, that she had survived being priced and shipped before, and could survive it again if it meant Doyle kept the life he'd built. She had the bundle over her shoulder and her hand on the door when he spoke from the bed behind her, awake the whole time, and asked her, without anger, only exhaustion, whether she truly believed he wanted any of what Cobb's finding claimed to protect for him if it cost him her. She said she was trying to spare him a fight that wasn't his to lose. He said, getting up, crossing the room, taking the bundle gently out of her hands and setting it down, that it had been his fight since the day UN sold him a debt he hadn't asked for and he'd chosen, every single day since, to keep it, and that a sheriff's paper did not get to make that choice for him now, any more than it had made it for him then. He did not ride to the county seat to argue the statute, understanding, better than most men might have, that a law written specifically to exclude her would not be reasoned out of excluding her by a foreman with no standing to change it. Instead, over the following days, he walked the camp himself, cabin to cabin, tent to tent, calling in every debt of gratitude Granite Creek owed his wife, without ever once using that word to ask for it. Hop Sing, who had promised her a witness whenever she needed one, and every man who had survived the fever alongside him, and the church wife who had left preserves at the door without a word, and even the county clerk, quietly, off the record, who admitted he'd always found the old statute a poor fit for a camp that had built half its economy on Chinese labor and Chinese ingenuity. Doyle asked each of them the same simple thing, to gather Sunday next, in the yard behind the cabin, and to witness, this time in numbers too large for any single sheriff to pretend hadn't happened, exactly what he intended to say to Mei Ling in front of all of them, license or no license, Sacramento's law or not. Word of the gathering spread the way word always spread at Granite Creek, and by Saturday evening even Mei Ling had heard the shape of it secondhand from Bertie, who reported breathlessly that half the camp seemed to be planning something for Sunday that nobody would explain to her directly. Mei Ling asked Doyle outright that night what he intended, and he told her plainly, without the shy hesitation he'd carried the first time he'd asked her anything, that he meant to marry her again, properly, in his own words, in front of every witness the camp could hold, whether the county's paper ever caught up to it or not. She asked what became of them if Cobb rode up in the middle of it and made an arrest of the whole affair, or if Pratt found some new lever to pull once the gathering broke. Doyle admitted he did not know, and that he could not promise her the law would ever agree with what the camp was about to say out loud. What he could promise, he said, taking both her hands, was that no one at Granite Creek would ever again be able to claim they hadn't seen, with their own eyes, exactly who she was to him, whatever a distant office chose to call it. Sunday came clear and cold in the way autumn mornings did, that high in the Sierra, and by midday the yard behind the cabin held more people than Mei Ling had ever seen gathered in one place at Granite Creek, rail crew and claim workers standing shoulder to shoulder with the church wives who had once left her off their supper lists. Hop Sing near the front with his mother's recipe, still a point of friendly argument between them, the county clerk standing quietly near the back in his own clothes rather than his office coat, present, he'd told Doyle, only as a neighbor. Bertie had woven late wildflowers into a small crown for her own hair and, without being asked, made one for Mei Ling too, standing on tiptoe to set it carefully over the jade hairpin rather than in place of it. Someone had strung bunting made from scraps of cloth between the porch posts, and someone else had brought a fiddle, though no one played it yet, the whole yard waiting for the thing they had walked up the grade to see. Mei Ling stood at the cabin door in the plain good dress she owned, the jade hairpin catching the light, and felt, for the first time since the platform, entirely unafraid of a crowd looking at her. Doyle stood in front of the whole gathered camp without a preacher this time, having decided, after a long talk with the clerk who could not officially help him but had offered advice all the same, that no man's ordination was going to be the thing that made this true, only his own word given publicly and permanently. He took both of Mei Ling's hands in the same spot on the porch where Cobb had stood to read his finding a week before, and he said, loud enough to carry to the back of the yard, that he did not need a license from Sacramento to tell this camp who his wife was, because every person standing in that yard already knew it, had known it since a fever broke and a ledger balanced, and a motherless girl learned to sew, and that he was marrying Mei Ling again, right here, with his own words, in front of every witness this camp could hold, and he intended to go on marrying her again, in front of this camp, every single time some distant office decided to say otherwise, for as long as it took the state to catch up to what Granite Creek had understood about her for a year already. The yard, for a moment, did not make a sound at all. When Mei Ling answered him, she spoke first in the language of her mother's dock at Canton, a short phrase she had never once said aloud in this country, words that meant, roughly, that she gave herself freely and was not given by any paper. And then she said the same thing again in English, in full, unhesitating sentences that carried to every corner of that yard, sentences built entirely her own, no longer crossing on careful stones the way her first months at Granite Creek had forced her to speak. She told the camp, in that English, that she had arrived here as an entry in a ledger with no name attached that anyone had bothered to get right, and that she stood here now as herself, chosen and choosing, in a language she had built word by word out of exactly this kind of patient listening, and that whatever a distant office called what was happening in this yard, she called it true. She reached up and touched the jade hairpin as she said it, the one object that had crossed the ocean owed to no one, and felt, for the first time, that it was no longer the only thing in her life that belonged entirely and only to her. Doyle asked then, the question a preacher would normally have asked, turning to face the yard rather than her, whether anyone gathered there would stand as witness that they had heard this marriage spoken, freely and completely, and would go on saying so to anyone, official or otherwise, whoever asked them again. The answer did not come as a single voice but as the whole yard at once, rail crew and claim men and church wives and the quiet county clerk all raising their hands or their voices together, an untidy, unrehearsed roar of agreement that startled the birds out of the pines above the cabin. And Hop Sing, grinning, called out that he'd told the sheriff himself he'd stand witness whenever asked. And here, at last, was his answer written in the largest ledger Granite Creek had ever kept, a whole camp's memory instead of a single clerk's signature. The fiddle finally started then, and the bunting caught the wind, and even the church wives who had once left her off their supper lists found themselves clapping along, because a yard full of people who had watched a woman save their lives and mend their fortunes does not easily go on pretending, once it has said so out loud, that it does not know exactly who she is. The celebration ran long into the evening, lanterns lit early against the mountain cold, Birdie falling asleep against the porch post, still wearing her flower crown. But underneath the fiddle music and the warmth of it, Mei Ling could not quite set aside the plain fact that nothing about Sacramento's statute had changed while the yard cheered. The claim was still, on paper, held solely in a single man's name. The county's findings still sat, unretracted, in some drawer at the sheriff's office, ready to be produced again the next time Pratt or someone like him decided the timing suited his interests. A whole camp's memory, however loud and however genuine, was not the same instrument as a deed or a license, and she understood, watching Doyle laugh with Hop Sing near the fire, that the hardest part of this particular fight might still be ahead of them rather than behind. That a law telling a woman her life did not exist did not simply stop saying so because 100 neighbors disagreed with it in a yard on a Sunday afternoon. She touched the jade hairpin again, thinking of her mother's voice, and wondered how long a stone could wear smooth against pressure that showed no sign of easing on its own. The workaround, when it came, arrived from an unexpected quarter. The same county clerk who had stood quietly at the back of the yard came to the cabin a week later, off the record, and explained that while he could not issue a marriage license the statute forbade, nothing prevented Doyle from filing the claim and cabin as a formal business partnership. Two named parties holding property jointly under commercial law rather than marital law, a mechanism common enough that no clerk in Sacramento would think twice about it. It was not everything. It did not undo Cobb's finding, or repeal the statute, or make the marriage the state still refused to recognize any less refused. But it put Mei Ling's name, her actual name spelled correctly for the first time on any document since the platform, onto a paper the law could not simply erase with a sheriff's reading, and Doyle filed it the following morning before the ink of the clerk's advice had dried. That same week, the assay office's books came under a company audit, prompted indirectly by the very ledger discrepancy Mei Ling had first caught over a year earlier, and Whitlock the assayer was quietly relieved of his post, with Pratt's name mentioned often enough in the inquiry that his credit line around camp thinned considerably afterward. Sheriff Cobb, watching Pratt's standing erode alongside the assayer's disgrace, found considerably less appetite in himself for pressing the matter of the Doyle household any further than the single finding he had already delivered, since enforcing a statute nobody in Granite Creek wanted enforced, on behalf of a merchant now widely regarded as a man who'd tried to steal from his own neighbors, offered him no advantage he cared to chase. He never formally withdrew his finding. Officially, the law still said what it said, and would go on saying it for years yet, in Sacramento, and in courthouses across the state, regardless of one camp's Sunday afternoon or one clerk's quiet partnership filing. But he stopped writing up the grade to ask further questions, and when a traveling inspector passed through the following spring and inquired, almost idly, about the household's arrangements, Cobb told him, without elaborating, that the matter had been settled to everyone's satisfaction and left it at that. A small, deliberate mercy from a man who had once read a verdict off a porch step without once meeting Mei Ling's eyes, and now, evidently, preferred not to revisit the memory of it. By the following autumn, the garden behind the cabin had doubled in size, the gingerbed thriving in ground Mei Ling had learned, over 3 winters, exactly how to shelter, and the partnership document sat framed, half as a joke and half as something neither of them wanted ever hidden in a drawer again, on the wall beside the door, where every visitor to the cabin would see both their names printed in the clerk's careful hand. Birdie, older now, split her days between the schoolteacher's lessons in the camp's new schoolhouse and her evening lessons with Mei Ling, whose characters she could now write almost as steadily as her English letters, and who had taken, without anyone quite deciding it, to calling Mei Ling something closer to family than housekeeper, in the easy way children settle such questions long before adults get around to naming them properly. Doyle's claim had grown too, Hop Sing working it alongside him now as a paid hand rather than a favor, the ledger Mei Ling kept balanced to the penny and respected, these days, by every office in the county that had once doubted whether a Chinese woman could be trusted with figures at all. On the evening of Birdie's 12th birthday, Mei Ling took the jade hairpin from her own hair for the second time in her life in front of witnesses and pressed it into the girl's palm the way her mother had once pressed it into hers on a dock in Canton, telling her, in the careful blend of 2 languages Birdie now understood equally well, that jade did not shatter under pressure, it only wore smoother, and that a person who could bend without breaking would always find their way home eventually, wherever home turned out to be. Birdie, who had crossed her own kind of hard road to get to this porch, closed her fingers around it and did not let go of Mei Ling's hand for a long while afterward. Doyle watched the 2 of them from the doorway with the particular quiet he now reserved for moments he intended to remember exactly as they happened, and thought that whatever Sacramento's law still refused to write down about the woman standing in his yard, Granite Creek had long since written its own record, in fevers broken and ledgers balanced, and a girl's steady hand learning 2 alphabets at once, a record no sheriff's paper had ever managed to erase, and none, he suspected, ever would.